All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we're exploring the absolutely fascinating historical and spiritual correlation between the collapse of massive empires and, well, our own internal decay. We spend so much of our daily energy fighting off problems that come at us from the outside, right? Stressors, competitors, or just sheer bad luck. But what if the real crisis, the one that actually brings the whole house down, starts entirely from within?
We're kicking things off with this brilliant observation from a history teacher, and it perfectly sets up our core thesis for today. True destruction never comes from the outside alone. Just think about that for a second. If you look closely at history, when a country finally crumbles under the weight of an external enemy, there are almost always internal fractures happening at the exact same time. We're talking betrayals, a total loss of identity, and a crumbling foundation that made the outside attack fatal in the first place.
So, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll be looking at the real cause of national ruin, the lessons from Rome's decline, the end of northern Israel, the reasons for its fall found in the Bible, and finally, building an unbreakable inner self. Let's get right into it. Section 1. Real cause of national ruin. External versus internal. Now, looking at the actual mechanics of how a nation falls, we really have to question our basic assumptions about military might. We tend to just assume that if an invading army is overwhelmingly powerful, destruction is, just inevitable math. But historical analysis pushes us to look a lot deeper. Is external force ever the sole reason for defeat? Is a giant army really enough to instantly erase a healthy, deeply unified and functioning society? Which brings us to Section 2, Lessons from Rome's Decline, a historical case study. To answer that question, we literally have the ultimate historical case study to look at. For the longest time, the prevailing thought was simply that the Roman Empire fell because Germanic tribes invaded. But if you look at Edward Gibbon's massive 18th century work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, it paints a much more complex internal picture. He argued that Rome, which was a superpower far more dominant in its time than even the United States is today, didn't just collapse overnight because some outside force knocked on the door. The mechanics of its destruction were deeply, deeply rooted within its own borders. You can see the stark contrast here between the old assumption of external invasion on one side and Gibbon's thesis of a slow, internal rotting on the other. Gibbon pointed out that long before the borders were ever breached, the citizens of Rome had lost the civic virtues that once made their empire robust. They basically fell into extreme luxury and moral decay, which directly crippled their military structure. Add to that an overexpanded territory that became a total logistical nightmare to administer. The external invasion, well, that was really just the final fatal blow to a tree that was already completely hollowed out inside. So the absolutely crucial point here is that unaddressed internal problems act exactly like a ticking clock. Eventually, they cause a nation to hit an expiration date when pressured from the outside. If a nation doesn't solve its internal rotting, the accumulated weight of those issues simply causes it to expire. The outside force is honestly just the catalyst that exposes an inner collapse that had been happening for decades. Let's move on to Section 3, the end of northern Israel, 2 Kings chapter 17. This dynamic builds a super fascinating framework for understanding the historical account of northern Israel's fall. Northern Israel, under its final ruler, King Hoshea, rebelled against the new Assyrian Empire by refusing to pay his mandatory tribute. To put this in perspective, the Assyrians were completely infamous for their psychological warfare and utterly ruthless sieges. They did not mess around. They reacted swiftly, imprisoning Hoshea and launching a grinding 3-year siege on the capital, Samaria, before finally breaking through and conquering it in Hoshea's 9th year. The physical result of this defeat was a devastating deportation. The Israelites were systematically stripped of their homeland and forced into a tragic exile. They were relocated roughly 600 kilometers away. To put that into perspective, that's nearly a 400-mile forced march to foreign regions near modern-day Syria, Iraq, and the Iranian plateau. This wasn't just a military loss. It was the complete and utter dismantling of their nation and their geographical identity. Section 4. Reason for fall in the Bible. Beyond military defeat. Looking at the timeline of this defeat, we have to pause and ask the deeper why. Was it really just due to a difference in military power? Was Israel wiped out simply because Assyria had iron weapons and a vastly superior army? Israel had faced incredibly powerful enemies before, like Aram, Egypt, and Moab, and they survived. They had suffered major defeats, sure, but they hadn't been wiped off the map. So was this final collapse just a matter of military mathematics? The biblical text emphatically says no.
It points directly to a catastrophic internal failure. Just look at this quote. It explicitly diagnoses the root cause. They had entirely forgotten the God who had previously rescued them from slavery in Egypt. And for them, this wasn't just some abstract theological concept, right? This was the foundational, historical source of their freedom, their life, and their identity. And they just completely forgot it.
Just like Rome's lost civic virtue, Israel's protective core decayed through a series of small, accumulating compromises. Actually, scratch that. It was a total erosion of their foundation. They forgot their history of salvation. They started fearing and worshiping other gods. They adopted foreign customs. And they blindly followed man-made royal decrees rather than their foundational laws. Obviously, none of this happened in a single day. It was a gradual, layer-by-layer decay of their internal world. There's this really profound psychological truth at play here, the empty space motif. Human nature literally abhors a vacuum. Just like a vacant lot in a city quickly gets overgrown with weeds, an empty spiritual heart always attracts new and usually destructive occupants. When the internal space meant for God was vacated by the Israelites, it didn't just sit empty. No way. It was immediately filled with foreign idols, human calculations, and fear. And that exact internal decay is what left them completely vulnerable and defenseless when the external Assyrian invasion finally came.
And that brings us to Section 5, building an unbreakable inner self, building resilience. This is where it gets incredibly personal for us today. Ultimately, this isn't just an explainer about ancient empires. It's a mirror for how we operate in our own lives. When external pressures hit, like failing health, financial crises, or tough relationships, we are so incredibly quick to blame the outside world for our stress. But our survival entirely depends on which of these two internal spaces we possess. Have we let our inner space become corrupted and filled with endless worries, complaints, and selfish calculations? Or is it a secured internal space, filled with grace, groundedness, and a solid remembrance of the past victories that keep us strong? So, the biggest takeaway from this explainer is this. True resilience against external storms requires securing the internal space. It is literally the only proven defense against the overwhelming forces of the outside world. Just as the Roman Empire and northern Israel didn't fall overnight, our own personal breakdowns are almost always the result of a slow internal emptying. But when your internal space is firmly secured and deeply rooted, you can weather almost any storm the outside world throws your way. So when the external pressure mounts, and it definitely will, what is currently filling the empty spaces in your heart? I'm going to leave you to reflect on that final thought today, because whatever is occupying that space is ultimately going to determine whether you stand firm or crumble when those external pressures inevitably arrive. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really encourage you to take some intentional time today to secure that internal space.